It's a peculiar story about four men with leprosy in a moment of incredible desperation. And I think it really fits into the moment that we're experiencing right now. Let me read it. It's in 2 Kings chapter 7, beginning in verse 3. Now there were four men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say, 'We'll go into the city,' the famine is there and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." At dusk, they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans. When they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army. So they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and their donkeys. They left the camp as it was, and they ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. Then they took silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid themselves. They returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. Then they said to each other, "What we are doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace." So they went and called out the city gatekeepers and told them, "We went into the Aramean camp, and no one was there, not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents just left as they were." The gatekeepers shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. This, for me, is one of those incredible moments where you see the contrast of desperation and hope. And a moment where four individuals had to make an ethical choice of whether they would live simply for themselves or live for others. Whether they would see the outcome of their lives as simply measured by how they came out of the situation, or whether they saw the outcome of their lives based on how many people they were able to help. We're in the middle of a crisis right now. And some of us have never imagined a moment like this one. There are people who are just absolutely filled with anxiety and fear, people who are anxious and distraught. And in fact, Kim told me the other day she was talking to one of the neighbors, and as she was talking to them, they were literally backing up, making sure they kept the distance away from her. And this is before they were telling us to be that cautious. And it seems like every week there have been new levels of precautions. Every week we're told to be in smaller and smaller and smaller groups. In fact, I don't know if we can get any smaller. Pretty much now we're supposed to be alone. And yet, in our aloneness, we can feel an incredible sense of loneliness and desperation. And what can happen is that we become completely focused on self-preservation. But for those of us who are in a relationship with the God who created us, for those of us who are in a relationship with Jesus Christ, we are never to the place where we should be filled with desperation, because we are never at the place where we've been abandoned. And when we have hope, and when we found a reason to live, when we found purpose and intention, when we can see the light in the middle of the darkness, we cannot wait till tomorrow to bring hope to other people. There's no waiting for daylight when people are struggling in the darkness. Now, let's just go back to the beginning. It says, now there were four men with leprosy, which, by the way, is a terrible way to tell your life story. If you feel like you're in a really bad place, imagine if your story began with, "And there were four men with leprosy." At the entrance of the city gate. In other words, they were outside of the city gate, but they were not allowed inside the city gate. It's not that they were not known. They probably had family inside the city gates. They probably had friends inside the city gates. In fact, there was probably a time in their life where they were allowed and permitted to be a part of the life of the society inside the city gates, but now they're outside of the protection of the city. And they're outside because they're lepers, and so the city has pushed them out because they're afraid they're going to contaminate everyone else. Does anything sound familiar here? They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die?" I love the optimism here. You have any friends who are just inherently really pessimistic? people who always think it's going to be the worst case scenario, people who are always telling you it's going to go downhill from here. In fact, I cannot tell you how many people have emailed my wife, have texted my wife, have emailed me, have texted me, telling me it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. And now this is going to happen. Now this is going to happen. Now this is going to happen. And here's the problem. When people are always negative, sometimes they're right. See, sometimes they're exactly right. The worst thing happened. Things did get worse. And the worst thing that can happen to a negative person is for their view to be validated, because now they're convinced that every negative thought they have is going to become the future. And so they open up with saying, why stay here until we die? They assess their situation. It was an honest, reasonable assessment of their condition. There were 4 lepers in a time of war, in a time of famine. Even the healthy were at risk. How in the world were these 4 lepers going to survive this time of famine? So they made a decision. If we do nothing, it's over for us. Why stay here until we die? Now, I'm not sure which one of the 4 of them actually assessed it this way, but I just love this assessment. Verse 4, if we say, we will go into the city, the famine is there, and we will die. And so now the city that was protecting themselves from the lepers, they cannot protect themselves from the famine. And so if we go into the city, we're just going to die with them. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the remains and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die. Somehow, I don't know if that's the most compelling vision for a future. But I do want you to notice that in the middle of this, there's something really powerful. Because in it, you discover the courage of desperation. There's this beautiful place where we can actually get to in our life in the middle of a crisis. We finally realize, wait a minute, if I do nothing, it's not going to go well. And if I make this choice or this choice or this choice, maybe none of it's going to go well. But what I need to do is I need to find the courage to move forward, because staying the same is no longer optional. You know, sometimes it's actually living in safety and security that is the end of us. That is the death of us. Because when we're safe, when we're secure, when we have that job we hate or have that life that is so monotonous and empty, we don't do anything about it because, well, we're not at risk. We can just keep on existing and existing and existing. There's something incredibly freeing and powerful about coming to that place of desperation where you finally decide, there's no point in staying here, because if I stay here, I'm going to die. And so I need to actually make a decision that looks like courage, but it's actually desperation. Have you ever found the courage of desperation in your life? That moment you realize, I don't have anything to lose, so I have everything to gain. I look at this moment and I see the paralysis all around me. I see people who are really genuinely terrified. And I don't know why, but I have this internal sense of even excitement, knowing, this is the moment where courage defines itself. This is the moment where faith actually elevates. This is the moment where when you are fully alive, you're not just existing, and you can be such a light in the middle of all the darkness, but there's just no waiting for daylight. You need to step into your faith, into your courage right now. I love his summary. If they spare us, we live. Otherwise, it's the same outcome as everything else. I wonder what God would have to do to get you to leave simply surviving, to choose to start thriving. What would God have to do to shake up the world, to shake up your life, to become dissatisfied with existing, to insist on living? Are you yet at the place where there's a desperation that can actually move you to say, God, I refuse to accept a life that is less than the life you created me to live? Let me just encourage you right now to find the courage of desperation that will move you forward, where you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And then it goes on in verse 5. It says at dusk, they got up and went to the camp of the Arameans, where they reached the edge of the camp and no one was there. For the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us. So they got up and fled in the dusk and abandoned their tents and their horses and their donkeys. And they left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. And so these four lepers finally journey down to the Aramean camp. They go to the enemy side because they know if they stay in the safety of their own kingdom, of their own land, they will die in the famine, and it'll be a slow, painful death. So they might as well cross to the enemy territory to take this huge risk of their lives to go into the Aramean camp to surrender themselves, which I think is this powerful metaphor. Because when they go to surrender themselves so they might live, they walk into the camp and all their Arameans are gone, and they left everything. They left in terror. I think it's so interesting that they were living in fear and didn't realize that their Arameans had already been driven out by their fear. They heard chariots and horses. They heard an army that wasn't coming. By the way, that was the army of God. And what this beautiful moment is revealing to us is that there is a victory that only comes in surrender. In the same way that we need to find the courage of desperation, we need to find the victory of surrender. I know the language of surrender is kind of a tricky language. We talk about surrendering our lives to Jesus or surrendering our lives to God. Because after all, you only surrender your life to an enemy, right? You only surrender to an enemy. You don't surrender to a friend. And yet, in the most extraordinary way, God says, you don't even realize it, but you've been warring against me. You've been warring against love, and you've been warring against hope. You've been warring against the life that I've created you to live. And it's not that God is at war against us, it's that we even sometimes, without consciously acknowledging it, have lived at war with God. And when we surrender to God, we think we're stepping into the worst case scenario, but it's in that moment you realize, oh, there's a victory in surrender. There's a life that I cannot live until I trust God with my life. I wonder if in your life you struggle with trust issues. I have so many friends that really struggle with trust issues. And they have a struggle with trust issues because they've trusted people in the past and they found them to not be trustworthy. And what happens so oftentimes is if you've trusted someone in the past and they let you down, they didn't prove to be trustworthy, that we project that on God. And so it's hard to trust God because we think that God is like the people in our lives. But I want you to realize that a part of the journey of surrendering to God is because there's this inherent fear that if we trust God, he's going to let us down. And this beautiful imagery, God had already gone ahead of them. God had already prepared the way. God had already fought the battle. And so these four lepers are going into a city they think they're going to have to surrender to, but they actually enter the city and find that the city has already been surrendered to them. What is God trying to get you to step into right now that he has already prepared the way for you? He has already won that battle for you. He has already liberated that city for you, but you're hiding, afraid, and so you're just living in the famine of your life rather than living in the abundance of what God has for you. But you can only step into it when you trust him. In the same way that you have to come to a place where you realize you just have nothing to lose and everything to gain. You have to come to that place and realize that life is found in the dying. That when you surrender your life, when you give your life up to Jesus, he gives you a life you could have never had, you could have never known. And so these four lepers were now the recipients of a city full of everything they could have ever hoped or asked or imagined. And so they did what most of us would do. They began living in the good life. In verse 8, it says, the men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents and ate and drank. They took silver and gold and clothes. I mean, really, what does a leper need with silver and gold? But they took all the silver and gold and clothes and went off and hid themselves. And then later they came back. Later they returned and went to another tent. And they took things from that one and they hid them also. So now you have these 4 lepers who have an entire city of abundance. And now they're just eating everything they can and drinking everything they can, but there's so much they cannot possibly consume everything that's there. And so they start taking gold and silver and clothes and hiding it so they can get to it later so that no one can ever have it. And I thought this is such a fascinating imagery. Because so what happens so oftentimes when we have a relationship with God is that we actually step into this peculiar place that I would call the abundance of favor, where God just seems to show up in your life and so many good things happen. And at first, it can almost confuse you into a false conclusion that God is pouring things into your life just so you can have more and more and more. And we end up living our lives like these 4 lepers in this city where there's more than they can ever have. Look, if God is working in your life right now, and God has given you so much, and he's poured so much into you, and there's a whole spectrum of people who have a relationship with Jesus. And some people are struggling every single day just to pay the bills, just to make it through the week. And there are others who have so much and they have so much abundance. But I don't want you to think for 1 minute that favor on your life is so that you can have so much more than everyone else. It's so that you can actually become more generous than everyone else. I saw this interesting contrast. The person wrote this fable, and they said, the problem is when someone gives you $10 and then someone else gives you $20, you tend to trust the person who gave you $20. But if you knew that the person who gave you $10 only had $10 and the person who gave you $20 had 200, would that change your perspective? And I thought this is so interesting. Because so oftentimes when we receive, we actually don't hear that as a mandate from God to be generous. So we're in a time of genuine crisis. I've heard estimates that we may face up to 20% unemployment, even if it's 5% or 10% or 15%. We have a time of genuine social crisis and concern. We have people who are losing their jobs everywhere. And I don't know if there's a better application or question to ask is, are you sitting in the abundance of all this favor and you are still just hoarding it for yourself and thinking that somehow God has been good to you just because he loves you more rather than because he trusted you with everything that you've been given? When you have more, you've been trusted with more. You've been trusted with more responsibility. And by the way, you've been trusted with more opportunity. And that to me is an incredible gift. What would you do if God gave you an entire city of wealth? Would you keep it to yourself? Would you hoard it? Would you just focus on self-protection and self-pleasure? Or would you eventually begin to ask the question, why would God give me so much and others so little, except that maybe God wants to use me as an instrument of good? And so the passage goes on in verse 9. It says, then they said to each other, what we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. So they went and called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, we went into Aramean camp and no one was there, not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents were left just as they were. So we have found a city of great wealth, and we are morally obligated to tell you that you don't have to live in this famine, that you can come and live and share in the abundance. And the gatekeepers shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. And by the way, the king didn't trust it. He didn't believe them. He thought it was a trap. It took some effort before he was willing to risk leaving the gates, stepping outside of the walls, stepping beyond the famine, and stepping into the provision that God had for them. Now, I wonder how many of us right now need to step into the courage of desperation and the victory of surrender and the abundance of favor so that we can actually move into the generosity of grace. So what this moment gives us is an opportunity to share with the world what we have so much of. And you might be here going, well, yeah, but I don't really have any money, and or I'm out of a job, or this crisis has just absolutely wrecked us. But if you have a relationship with Jesus, you have an abundance of grace to give. You do. You have an abundance of joy, an abundance of hope. You have abundance of encouragement. Don't let anyone or any circumstance convince you that you do not have so much to give to the world. Because right now, somebody may just need compassion. See, right now, there may be someone who's just so afraid and they're isolated and alone, and what they need from you is just a call. They just need a text or an email. They just need you to reach out and ask them, are you doing okay? See, some people just need just a small dose of compassion and kindness. They just need some tenderness and some gentleness. So there's somebody out there right now who just needs some forgiveness, need a second chance. They need someone who believes in them again. There are people in your life right now, and they just need some hope, and they just need some encouragement. They just need to believe they can get through this moment. They need to know that the future is going to be better than this, that tomorrow is going to be better than today, and that we have the resilience and the strength to overcome this crisis. Don't believe for 1 second you do not have what the world needs most. 4 lepers, because they were so desperate, they decided to just step into a future they couldn't imagine. 4 lepers who became the source of all, not just the wealth, but all the hope that an entire people desperately needed. 4 lepers understood the ethics of sharing, of caring, of giving, of generosity. 4 lepers who came to the realization, we cannot keep this to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, no, we cannot wait until daylight to share such good news. It's crazy, but this moment becomes the kind of moment where people begin to ask questions like, where is God? These are the kind of moments where people begin to ask deep, meaningful questions. And who's going to be there to let them know, hey, I want you to know there's really good news in the middle of this. Because in the middle of famine, if you're feasting on the hope that Jesus brings and the love that Jesus brings and the life that Jesus brings, and you're keeping it to yourself, how in the world will we ever explain that? That we waited for daylight to bring hope to people who are desperately afraid. You may be listening right now, and you feel like your life is just a famine. You feel like you can't find hope. It's hard to breathe. You're just struggling just to make it through the day. You don't know where your next paycheck's going to come from. You're not sure if you're going to have a job when all of this is said and done. And I want you to know that you are not alone. But there's a God who loves you, who sees you, who knows you. And in this moment, he wants to bring to you the hope you desperately need. The future that you hope is out there can actually be in here. That's why Jesus came 2,000 years ago. That's why he stepped into human history, so that you and I could know this beautiful, beautiful good news. That there's a God who died for us, who rose from the dead. There's a God who took on flesh and blood and walked among us. And that his name is Jesus. And that he's here right now in the middle of this crisis. Jesus is waiting for you to open up your life to him, to trust him. And so if you're listening right now and you've never crossed the line of faith and put your trust in Jesus, I want to invite you right now just to join me in just a brief prayer where you give your life to Jesus. Remember when those lepers said, hey, let's just go and surrender, because if they accept us, then we'll live. See, I want you to know that right now, if you would just trust Jesus with your life, you're going to be surprised, because he's going to receive you and love you and forgive you and set you free. Would you pray with me right now? Just one simple prayer, just one sentence. Jesus, I give you my life. Right now, just tell him, Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, I give you my life. In this moment, wherever you are, just pause and take a deep breath. Recognize that God is with you. There is no famine that God cannot take you through. No crisis that God will not show you the way. No darkness where he will not bring a light. So wherever you are right now, I want you to find, maybe it's just the courage of desperation. Let it begin there. Say, God, I just need you. I cannot do this alone. I need you in my life. Then for those of us who are in a relationship with Jesus, man, there's no waiting for daylight. This is your moment. This is your moment to share love. This is your moment to share hope. This is your moment to share life. This is your moment to share who Jesus is in your life. Because in this moment of crisis, people are searching for God, and you're supposed to point the way. Father, I thank you so much that you meet us in times like this. In a very real way, we've all been the lepers who came to the desperate end of ourselves. When we surrendered ourselves, we found a life that we never even knew we could have. God, I thank you that when we belong to you, we are under that abundance of favor, and that you just are so good to us. But God, I know that favor is not always the same. It's disproportionate. And that you give us the responsibility of being instruments of good. And God, I want to pray for those right now who are listening, who are doing really well, who have the opportunity to bless others, who own companies that they might help their employees. God, for those who have a little bit more than they need and they can share, I pray, God, that you would put in them, God, just that grace of generosity to see themselves as your instrument to expand the good in this time of crisis. We thank you, Jesus, and we pray in your name. Amen.